It was a rainy Tuesday morning in rural Georgia, the kind of morning where the sky looked like an old gray blanket stretched too thin and the air smelled of wet asphalt and pine. When retired Army Staff Sergeant Malik Thompson and Navy Petty Officer Second Class Jerome Davis pulled into the cracked gravel lot outside Maggie's diner, a modest roadside refuge that had stood through 5 presidents, 3 hurricanes, and the steady decline of small-town America. The faded red and white sign still buzzed faintly above the entrance like it always had, and the scent of frying bacon, stale coffee and worn-out vinyl booths greeted them with a familiarity deeper than blood. The 2 men, both veterans of wars, most folks had stopped mentioning by name, had made it a tradition to meet every few months at this place that held no pretensions, just heart and hash browns, and though the years and the VA paperwork had piled up like rust on an old truck, their brotherhood never faded. Malik, tall and broad with a quiet intensity, wore his desert camo jacket like armor, patches faded and frayed but stitched with history his name, his unit, his country all sewn over a heart still scarred by things he never spoke of. Jerome, lean and wiry with a sailor's smirk and eyes that had stared across the Arabian Sea and into the void of more than one bad night, wore his faded USS Carl Vinson cap pulled low, the brim soft from years of sun and salt and grief. They walked in with the heavy ease of men used to watching doors, nodding to the elderly white couple at the counter, Mr. and Mrs. Harwick, who always came in early and read the paper aloud like it was still 1958, and waving to Maggie herself, the stout sharp-hide owner who ruled her kitchen with a spatula and a heart as wide as the highway. "Morning, boys," she said, flipping bacon on the griddle with one hand and refilling a mug with the other. "Your usual booth's open." They slid into their corner spot, the one with the cracked green leather in view of the whole room, and set down their hats, their shoulders relaxing ever so slightly like soldiers who finally got to sit with their backs to the wall. "Same as always," Maggie called, already scribbling the order. "Yes, ma'am," Malik said, his voice gravel and honey. "Extra hot sauce," Jerome added. They clinked coffee mugs like they were toasting to something neither could name, and for a moment all was still, just the rain tapping the window, the sizzle from the grill, and the unspoken gratitude of surviving long enough to enjoy something simple. But peace is fragile in places where suspicion lingers like mold in the drywall, and they had barely taken their first sips when the diner door creaked open with a gust of wet wind, and in stepped Officer Ken Bledsoe, a man whose presence sucked warmth out of the room like a draft through a broken seal. He was tall in that overfed, red-faced way that suggested power without discipline, his belly brushing the edges of his utility belt, and his eyes constantly scanning for something to dominate. Everyone knew Bledsoe. He patrolled the county like it was his private plantation, always had a smirk for pretty waitresses, a scowl for anyone black, brown, or breathing wrong, and a nasty habit of reminding people that his word weighed more than theirs, especially when there were no cameras rolling. His boots squeaked on the tile as he walked in, steam rising off his rain-soaked shoulders, and the air shifted. Maggie's spatula paused mid-turn. The Harwicks lowered their paper, and Jerome instinctively straightened up, his jaw clenching, while Malik stared out the window like counting trees could keep the peace. Bledsoe's eyes locked on them like radar, narrowed and probing, his mouth curling in something between suspicion and disdain. "You two just passing through?" he asked, the words stretched with sarcasm, his voice just loud enough to remind everyone who he was. Malik, who had stared down insurgents in Fallujah and politicians at the VA, answered calmly, "No, sir. We've been coming here for years." Bledsoe took a step closer, his boots echoing like gunshots. "Just making sure you're not casing. The joint been a lot of break-ins around here. Can't be too careful." The silence in the diner turned thick, like syrup gone cold. Maggie stopped moving entirely, her hands resting on the counter. The Harwicks looked away, pretending to read an article about soybean futures. Jerome took a slow breath. "We serve this country, officer," he said, voice low but firm. "We deserve to drink our coffee in peace." But Bledsoe didn't back off. His hand hovered near his belt, where the baton sat too eagerly. "I'd," he snapped. "Both of you now." The insult hung in the air like a slap. Malik didn't move, didn't blink. "Are we being accused of something?" he asked, still looking out the window, where the rain was now coming down in hard sheets. "Don't get smart with me," Bledsoe barked, his tone sharper now, tinged with the anger of a man unused to being questioned. "You fit the description." "What description?" Jerome said, rising halfway out of his seat, eyes locked on Bledsoe's blackened sitting. "In a booth." Malik placed a hand on Jerome's arm, steady grounding. "Don't," he muttered. "Not here." Bledsoe's face reddened further. "You people think you can throw the veteran card and do whatever you want. Well, not on my watch. You people," Maggie echoed under her breath, her spatula slamming onto the grill. "That's enough, Kenny." But Bledsoe ignored her, his focus entirely on making a show. "Either you give me your IDs right now, or I'll detain you both for failure to comply." Malik stood slowly, unfolding himself with the deliberate calm of a man who knew exactly how badly things could go. "We came here for coffee," he said, his voice low but resonant. "And now you're trying to turn it into a scene." "I said ID," Bledsoe snapped again, stepping forward, And that's when the door creaked open once more, a soft sound, almost lost in the storm outside, and everyone turned expecting maybe another local, maybe someone just trying to warm up and get dry, but instead they saw a tall figure silhouetted against the gray morning, stepping in with the quiet precision of someone who didn't need to raise their voice to be heard. He was dressed in a long black coat that still glistened with raindrops, a fedora tilted against the wind, and he moved with an easy authority that made even Bledsoe pause for half a breath. The man took off his hat slowly, revealing salt and pepper hair cut close to the scalp and calm penetrating eyes that missed nothing. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. He just surveyed the room, taking in Malik and Jerome standing by their booth. Bledsoe puffed up and red with rage, Maggie frozen behind the counter, the Hawicks holding their breath. Then, without a word, he walked past them all and took a seat at the counter, setting his hat down with care, like a ritual. He nodded at Maggie. Coffee, black. Maggie, still stunned, poured without speaking. The man took a sip, then turned slightly in his stool so his voice would carry. "I've seen this movie before," he said, not loud, but with a gravity that pulled everyone's attention. "It always starts the same. Someone with a badge decides who belongs and who doesn't. Happens in diners, gas stations, parks, you name it. Same story, same silence from everyone watching." Bledsoe's jaw clenched. "You need to mind your business, sir." The man turned to look at him directly. "And you need to remember what oath you swore." He reached into his coat, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open with the ease of muscle memory. What he revealed wasn't a badge from the local precinct, but a sleek, federal ID, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. The diner went dead silent. Bledsoe took a step back. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Robert Gaines, Special Counsel. Been investigating patterns of civil rights violations in this region. Seems I didn't even have to dig to find one." He looked over at Malik and Jerome. "You gentlemen okay?" Malik nodded slowly. Jerome let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Bledsoe stammered, "This isn't what it looks like." Gaines stood now, his presence suddenly towering. "It looks exactly like what it is. Two black veterans, quietly having coffee, harassed without cause by an officer who's let his authority rot into something toxic." He turned to Maggie. "You have cameras?" She nodded, her voice finding strength, always rolling. "Audio." To Gaines looked back at Bledsoe. "You've got 5 minutes to walk out that door before I call your supervisor and your union rep. After that I start typing my formal complaint and, trust me, I'm not new at this." Bledsoe's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Gaines took a step closer. "No. What's ridiculous is you thinking no one would ever stand up. What's ridiculous is you forgetting that power is a responsibility, not a weapon. And what's finally changing is the silence." And as Bledsoe turned and stormed out into the rain, boots slapping the wet pavement, the whole diner seemed to exhale at once, as if a spell had been broken and sunlight might one day break through the storm. The rain had not let up, and as Officer Bledsoe's squad car disappeared into the misty blur of the Georgia highway, its tires hissing over the slick pavement like a snake retreating into tall grass, the tension inside Maggie's diner didn't vanish so much as it settled differently, like a storm cloud that had passed but left behind thunder in the bones of those who'd felt its wrath. Malik Thompson and Jerome Davis remained standing by their booth, the coffee on the table now gone cold, their muscles still tight with the memory of confrontation, their eyes scanning the room not for danger but for dignity, trying to reclaim the fragile piece of peace they'd carried in with them that morning. Robert Gaines, the stranger who wasn't truly a stranger anymore but had arrived with the quiet resolve of a man who'd spent his life walking into fire so others could breathe, remained seated at the counter, sipping his coffee with calm deliberation, his DOJ credentials now tucked away but pulsing invisibly in the air like a badge of truth no one could deny. Maggie, still behind the counter but now with her jaw set like granite and her eyes watering not with weakness but with anger, the kind of anger born from too many mornings seeing good men like Malik and Jerome treated like suspects before they were ever seen as sons, soldiers, or citizens, began bustling around the kitchen with unnecessary tasks, scrubbing already clean counters and wiping spotless mugs, because she needed something to do with her hands to keep from shouting, crying, or both. The Hawicks, usually chatty and wrapped in the safety of nostalgia, remained frozen in place, Mr. Hawick's newspaper folded on his lap, his wife clutching her purse as though its contents could offer a distraction from the shame crawling up their necks, because they had seen what happened, they had watched what happened, and they had said nothing, not because they agreed with Bledsoe, but because fear and discomfort had stitched their mouths shut like they were children watching their home collapse in slow motion. "Sit," Gaines said softly, motioning to Malik and Jerome, who exchanged a brief glance before easing back into the booth like soldiers exiting a foxhole, every movement deliberate and measured, their instincts still on high alert even as the threat had physically left the building. "You're good men," Gaines continued, his voice rich and steady like an old jazz record, "and you didn't deserve a damn second of that." Malik finally spoke, his voice low but textured with both gratitude and caution. We've dealt with worse. You get used to it, but you never stop feeling it. Gaines nodded. That's the part they don't get. The feeling. Jerome, still twitching with adrenaline, took off his cap and ran a hand over his bald head. Who are you, really? I mean, DOJ, yeah, but what made you walk in today? Right now. At that moment, Gaines smiled faintly. Let's just say I've been watching this town for a while. Not just this diner, but the whole county. It's part of a federal initiative targeting police misconduct patterns in rural areas. I was headed out of town when I stopped for coffee. Fate, I guess. Malik scoffed quietly. Funny how fate always seems to show up when we're one wrong. Look away from a mugshot. Maggie walked over then, refilling everyone's cups with a determination that dared anyone to comment on her eavesdropping. What that man did was disgusting, she muttered. He's been on a power trip for years. Some folks complained. Nothing ever came of it. Guess we all just stopped expecting change. Gaines met her eyes. Then maybe it's time to start expecting again. He sipped his coffee. Do you have the footage? Maggie nodded, reaching beneath the counter to retrieve a small external hard drive. Audio and video, like I said. I'll make you a copy. Gaines took the device, slipping it into his coat like a lit match into dry brush. This is gold. This will speak louder than any statement. Mr. Harwick cleared his throat from the counter, his voice brittle and hesitant. If you need a witness statement. My wife and I, we saw the whole thing. Gaines turned to them. That would be appreciated. Mrs. Harwick blinked rapidly, as if waking up from a dream. We didn't mean to stay silent. We were just scared. Jerome nodded slowly. That's how they win. Every time we stay quiet, they grow bolder. Gaines looked at the two veterans. You both ever consider filing a civil rights complaint? Malik shrugged. What's the point? It's their word against ours. Not anymore, Gaines said, tapping the hard drive in his coat. Now it's your word and a dozen witnesses. And video. That's not just a complaint, that's a case. A strong one. Silence settled over the room again, but this time it wasn't heavy, it was contemplative, like a field right before the seeds crack open. Maggie broke it first. You boys better eat something. That officer didn't just disrespect you, he interrupted your damn breakfast. And I won't allow that. She turned to the grill and began plating their usual orders without asking. Malik cracked a rare smile. Thank you, Maggie, Jerome added, for standing up means more than you know. She didn't respond with words, just a determined nod as she slid plates of eggs, grits, sausage, and toast onto their table. Gaines stood then, his coffee half empty, but his mission suddenly overflowing. I'll be in touch. You'll have a formal notice from our office by the end of the week. There'll be paperwork, interviews, maybe a deposition or two, but you won't be alone. And if you want a lawyer, I know several who specialize in this kind of thing and will take the case pro bono. Malik looked up at him, the years of service, in his eyes clashing with a lifetime of quiet indignities. Why do you care? Gaines paused at the door, placing his hat back on his head. Because once upon a time, someone stood up for me, a teacher who called out a cop for dragging me out of school because I fit a description. That teacher changed everything. I owe it forward. And because I believe this country owes its veterans more than flags and parades, we owe them justice. With that, he disappeared back into the rain, his coat flaring behind him like a shadow torn loose from history. Inside, Maggie resumed serving eggs to truckers and hash to drifters, but the energy in the room had shifted, had grown like soil after a storm, made richer by the breaking of something old. Malik and Jerome ate in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because, for the first time in a long time, their silence was not demanded, it was chosen. And in that silence lived something radical, possibility. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and the first sliver of sunlight broke through, glinting off the Maggie's Diner sign like a promise just beginning to form. The storm passed, but its echo lingered in the sidewalks, in the eyes of locals who kept stealing glances at Malik Thompson and Jerome Davis as if they had become symbols of something greater overnight, as if the quiet walls of Maggie's Diner had become the unlikely birthplace of a reckoning no one had expected and few dared to name aloud. By midweek, the story had leaked first as whispers, then as a rush of digital lightning across the social media channels of Georgia veterans groups, civil rights activists, and regional journalists desperate for substance in a cycle, starved for more than political bickering and celebrity scandal. The footage from Maggie's security system, trimmed and shared with the careful guidance of Robert Gaines himself, made its way from a few local inboxes to national outlets with terrifying efficiency. The image of Officer Ken Bledsoe looming over two seated black veterans demanding identification without cause was damning enough. But it was the audio, the slow, measured dignity of Malik asking, "Are we being accused of something?" that struck the deepest chord, triggering outrage from Marine bases in Quantico to high-rise boardrooms in Atlanta where CEOs and generals alike recognized something too familiar in the weight of that question. Meanwhile, Malik and Jerome found their lives upended not just by the incident but by the tidal wave of attention that followed. Calls from reporters, requests from national veteran organizations, letters from strangers both white and black, young and old, some offering to support, others venom. but all reminding them that their lives were now caught in the gravity of a national moment. And through it all, they stayed grounded, still meeting at Maggie's every few days, still ordering the same breakfast, still watching the windows like old sentries, aware that their fight wasn't over but unsure what form the next battle would take. The media storm did what media storms always do. It spun in 10 different directions at once one morning. A conservative news anchor accused the two veterans of baiting a hard-working officer just doing his job, while that same evening, a liberal pundit compared Malik and Jerome to the Freedom Riders of the 1960s, conveniently ignoring the toll of scrutiny being placed on two men who hadn't sought attention, only peace. Robert Gaines returned to town that Thursday, this time in an official capacity, accompanied by a pair of federal attorneys and 2 agents from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, all of them calm, polished, and raised. They met with the police chief, a red-faced, sweat-slicked man named Harold Withers, behind closed doors, where voices rose and tensions spiked like barbed wire snapping taut. Outside, reporters circled like vultures, and inside, Maggie kept the coffee hot and the plates coming, refusing to let the press or the politics disrupt her one act of daily defiance, feeding people without prejudice. Malik, meanwhile, found himself caught between memory and movement, memory of the battles fought overseas and at home, the bureaucratic trenches of the VA, the friends buried without medals or recognition, and movement, this strange momentum, now pushing him toward something he hadn't planned for, leadership. Jerome was quicker to adjust, relishing the chance to finally put his sharp wit and sailor's voice to public use. He spoke on a panel at a local college, appeared on a podcast about systemic bias in rural law enforcement, and even gave an impromptu speech at a local VFW where the older white vets stood silent at first but slowly, visibly, began to nod. Still, the fallout from that rainy morning wasn't without consequences. Bledsoe, now suspended pending federal investigation, appeared on a few right-wing broadcasts trying to defend his actions with half-truths and veiled bigotry, claiming that veterans were combative and refused lawful orders. But his words rang hollow against the clarity of the footage, and his union, once ready to protect him with legal armor, began to distance itself like a house disowning a leaky pipe before the flood. And yet, in a small county where racism was often dressed in politeness and hidden behind bake sales and PTA meetings, not everyone was ready to welcome change with open arms. Anonymous notes began appearing on Maggie's front door, some warning, others threatening. One morning, someone slashed the tires of her delivery truck, and another night, Malik found a dead squirrel nailed to his garage door, its body twisted grotesquely and its eyes gouged out with a coin shoved into its mouth, an ancient ugly symbol that needed no translation. Gaines urged them to stay vigilant, to let the process unfold, to not give in to fear or the temptation of vengeance. "They want you angry," he said over coffee one morning. "They want you loud and reckless, but your strength is in your calm. It's what shook them that day, and it's what keeps you dangerous now." Malik nodded but didn't reply. He had spent years surviving in environments where rage was currency, where anger kept you alive, and learning to suppress that instinct, now, when injustice once again had come for him in uniform, felt like wrestling with his own shadow. Still he endured. Jerome cracked jokes, told stories, and reminded him that change wasn't for the comfortable. "They hate us because we're still here," Jerome said one night as they watched the sun set over the county line. "They wanted us broken, silent, gone, but we came back. We sat down for breakfast and we didn't flinch." The next chapter of the saga began when Gaines officially announced a joint investigation into the practices of the county sheriff's department, backed by the DOJ and a coalition of veteran advocacy groups who had seen the footage and refused to look away. Public hearings were scheduled, testimonies were gathered, and slowly, officers who had once turned blind eyes began to whisper about quotas, racial profiling, and unofficial policies that punished dissent and rewarded aggression. One sergeant, a Latino man with 20 years on the force, quietly handed over a journal he had kept page after page documenting encounters, stops, and orders from above that clearly violated civil rights. It was the kind of evidence no one could ignore, and suddenly, what had started as one officer's abuse of power became a referendum on an entire system. The town was split. Churches debated the issue in hushed tones, school teachers tried to explain it to wide-eyed children, and old men on porches shook their heads, some in shame, some in fury, some in both. But through it all, Malik and Jerome refused to retreat. They weren't seeking fame or revenge, they were demanding recognition, accountability, change, and they were joined by others. A white nurse who remembered being pulled over for no reason and watched her black boyfriend searched like a criminal. A young black high school student who had been suspended for talking back when he asked why only he had to take off his hoodie in class. An elderly Korean War veteran who recalled being told decades ago to use the colored waiting room at the VA clinic and realized nothing had truly changed until now. Their voices began to form a chorus, and that chorus began to shake the foundations of the county courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the diner where it all began. One morning, Gaines returned with a folder in his hand and steel in his eyes. "We've got it," he said, sitting down across from Malik and Jerome. "Enough for charges. Enough to move the needle." "What happens now?" Jerome asked. "Now," Gaines replied, "we push it all the way. We make them answer. We don't stop until this place remembers who it belongs to, everyone." And with that, the veterans who had once come only for coffee and quiet found themselves at the center of a storm once more, not of rain this time, but of reckoning. The morning of the public hearing arrived, not with thunder but with a strange hush, the kind that precedes a seismic shift, and as the townspeople filled the courthouse auditorium, locals, veterans, students, news crews, even tourists who had read about the incident in national headlines, the atmosphere crackled with a fragile tension, somewhere between hope and fear, like a community standing on the edge of its own reflection and unsure whether it would see courage or cowardice. Staring back, Malik Thompson stood in the hallway outside the chamber, dressed not in uniform but in a navy blue suit that bore the quiet dignity of his service, flanked by Jerome Davis, who had opted for a charcoal gray blazer over a crisp white shirt, his service ribbons pinned proudly above his heart as if to say, "I earned my voice in places none of you dared to walk." Hand between them stood Robert Gaines, calm as always, a man who had danced with bureaucracies and buried more injustices than he cared to count, now holding a thick folder in one hand and conviction in the other, his presence like a lighthouse amid the crashing waves of institutional denial and buried truths. The sheriff, Harold Withers, sat inside the chamber already, jaw clenched, cheeks mottled, trying to maintain composure before the cameras while his legal team whispered and shuffled papers. His department now under formal federal scrutiny, his command staff fractured, and his legacy teetering at the edge of disgrace. And yet, he held to the belief that this was just a storm to be weathered, that the world would soon forget, that the system would protect him the way it always had, but not this time. Because when Malik stepped to the podium, the room did not hear anger, it heard exhaustion wrapped in resolve. A voice so measured it landed like poetry on granite. "I serve this country not to be feared in it, but to be a part of it. That morning I was not a threat, I was hungry. We had come for breakfast, not battle." And when Jerome followed, with a voice that thundered through the hall and into the hearts of every sleeping conscience, he didn't mince words. "You don't get to wrap yourself in law and call it justice when all you do is hide your fear of people who look like me. I wore the uniform. I carried the rifle. I buried brothers who never came home. And you think I need to explain why I want eggs and coffee in my hometown?" The gallery erupted not in chaos, but in applause, slow and reverent, like something sacred had been spoken at last. Gaines then presented evidence, the video, the witness statements, the journal from the Latino sergeant turned whistleblower, and a timeline of patterns so damning that even the governor's office, once silent, issued a statement within hours expressing grave concern over the practices of the county's law enforcement. The hearing continued for hours, officers testifying in fear and relief, residents telling stories they had buried for years, pastors speaking of prayers unanswered, and children taught to avoid cops not because they were guilty, but because they were brown. Bledsoe, now disgraced and desperate, attempted to defend himself when called to the stand, his voice cracking as he insisted he only followed protocol. But under cross-examination it became clear his protocol was prejudice, a string of stops, citations, and confrontations disproportionately targeting black citizens, stitched together like a quilt of cruelty sewn in uniform blue. Outside the courthouse, crowds grew, not mobs but movements. Students, veterans, nurses, truck drivers, barbers, waitresses, even a group of elderly white women from the local book club who carried signs that read, "Justice is always served late," her all standing shoulder to shoulder, not for spectacle, but for something long overdue, reckoning. National news outlets swarmed. Civil rights leaders arrived quietly, not to lead, but to witness. And through it all, Maggie, whose diner had returned to a strange normal, watched from her counter, refilling coffee cups and reminding every patron that what began in her little corner of America had become a kind of revolution. Days later, the DOJ formally announced sweeping reforms in the county, oversight boards with community input, retraining programs led by veterans like Malik and Jerome, and the resignation of Sheriff Withers under federal pressure, his face pale, and his badge surrendered in silence. Officer Bledsoe was indicted on multiple counts, not just for civil rights violations, but for falsifying reports in over 24 traffic stops involving minorities. His arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but the photo of him in handcuffs, once the face of unchecked authority, now stripped of swagger and smirk, circulated widely, a symbol not of revenge but of rare accountability. Malik and Jerome, though offered interviews and book deals and media tours, declined most. Instead, they established the Justice and Service Foundation, a nonprofit focused on helping veterans of color navigate civilian life while advocating for reform in law, enforcement training, and veteran affairs. The foundation, headquartered in a refurbished community center near Maggie's diner, became a place where stories were told, wounds were acknowledged, and policy was born not from theory but from lived experience. Gaines, after the case concluded, returned to Washington but remained a friend. mentor and frequent visitor, often joining the men at the same booth where it all began. Sipping his coffee slowly, smiling as Maggie refused to charge him and instead placed homemade pie in front of him like a blessing. Over time, the town changed not overnight, and not perfectly, but genuinely. Recruitment practices shifted, community liaisons were hired, and the police department began hosting open forums, where residents could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Schools added curriculum on civil rights history, led in part by Malik, who had discovered a quiet talent for teaching, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived the lessons he taught. Jerome, ever the loudest in the room, started a podcast, Breakfast and Truth, where he interviewed veterans, activists, police, and politicians alike. His charisma undeniable and his sense of humor sharp enough to slice through even the densest spin. And Maggie, who never closed her doors despite the threats, became a local hero in her own right. Her diner now adorned with a mural that stretched across the brick exterior, a painting of two black veterans seated in a booth, steam rising from their coffee, and behind them, the outline of a man in a trench coat with a briefcase under one arm and justice in his eyes. The mural bore no names, but everyone knew. They knew what had happened there. They knew what had changed, and most importantly, they knew who had stood up not because they had to, but because it was right. And so, what began as a simple breakfast, turned hostile by hatred, ended as a movement, a declaration that dignity would no longer be optional, that service deserved respect regardless of skin, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with marches or megaphones, but with a quiet refusal to be dehumanized over bacon and eggs. Malik, Jerome, and Gaines remained bound not by trauma, but by triumph. Three men who had come together in the unlikeliest of ways, who had stood up in the face of tyranny disguised as routine, and who had shown the country that courage doesn't always wear a cape. It sometimes wears dog tags, sips coffee, and says, with calm defiance, "This seat is mine."